This is The Audience Connection, the podcast where we go into what content actually connects and into why it sticks.
Sponsored by Casual, where behavioral science meets storytelling to build trust for your audiences.
We're your hosts. I'm Ollie Atkinson.
And I'm Lydia Chan. Hey guys, welcome back to The Audience Connection. Today's episode challenges one of the most common mistakes in brand strategy, making your brand the hero of the story.
Yeah, and it's a mistake that almost every brand makes without realizing it. So today our guest is Kristian Aloma. He is the founder and CEO of Threadline, and he's got a PhD in psychology. Before that, he started out his career in pharmaceutical advertising. So now he works at the intersection between narrative psychology and brand strategy.
And his core argument is that your brand can't be the hero. Your audience has to be. The moment you forget that, you end up with the Pepsi Kendall Jenner moment or the Radio Shack "You've got questions, we've got answers" campaign that completely fell apart because that wasn't the reality of their narrative.
Yeah, that's right. And we all remember those campaigns because they were so bad. So it's not the kind of feeling you want attached to your brand. And what I really loved about this conversation with Kristian is Kristian doesn't treat a story as something that sits downstream of strategy. He argues that storytelling work has to begin right up at the strategy level before you've even uttered a single word to your customers. And he gives us a framework for doing exactly that. And it's called the Story Framework. Now, I'll let you go into the episode to find out more about that, but you can apply it on Monday morning on your own work.
Yeah, you guys also get into the difference between story and narrative, why self-report research is mostly broken and the simple shift that fixes it, and a really sharp take on AI as the definition of a sociopath. And for the internal comms folks listening, why bullet points are the fastest way to kill a story.
Yeah, I mean, I've been telling everyone since this conversation that AI is a sociopath. But one of the most memorable anecdotes we had on the show involved a man, his motorcycle, and the sound of his wife giving birth. So I'm going to let you listen on for that one.
So if you've ever sat in a brand workshop and felt like the work was about the brand rather than the people it's for, this one's going to rewire how you think about it. So let's get into it. Here's Ollie and Kristian Aloma.
Hello and welcome back to The Audience Connection. So at Casual and generally, I think we all spend a lot of time in organizations thinking about messaging, what we want to say, how clearly we can say it, and how we package that up into content. But underneath all of that, there's a deeper layer that often gets missed because people don't just receive messages, they interpret them through story that they already believe about themselves. And that then raises a much bigger question, which isn't what are we saying, but what's the role we are playing in the story our audience is already living. And so to explore that today, I'm joined by Kristian Aloma, whose work focuses on the idea of narrative economy. And that idea is what's really been exchanged isn't information or even value, but identity, meaning and belonging. So in this episode, we're going to explore the difference between story and narrative, why the audience, not the brand, has to be the hero, and what this means for anyone trying to create work that genuinely connects. Kristian, welcome to The Audience Connection. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, look, as we always do at the start of these episodes, it would be great if you could take us through a little bit about how you got into psychobiographical research. How did you end up doing what you're doing? Because it's not a natural. When I came across your work via Will Leach, who was one of our guests as well, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. But can you tell us a bit of your journey of how you got to where you are?
It was a stumble, if you will, into this space. It wasn't a path that I had set out as a high schooler, deciding I wanted to one day grow up to be a psychology-oriented market researcher. I began my career in advertising and pharmaceutical advertising specifically. And I remember there was a moment that we were conducting, as most advertising agencies will do, focus groups around some of the concepts that we were developing for a client. And this was for one of our clients, and the brand idea was about peace of mind, that doctors could, feel comfortable prescribing this product to their patients. And it included an image of a doctor at his desk with his feet up on his desk and his hands behind his head, like just completely relaxed and at ease with the choice that he's made. And we were testing this with physicians at the time, exposing them to the concepts. And I was sitting in the back room. I was fresh out of college, still wet behind the ears, just observing what's going on. And I remember listening, and one of the doctors said they didn't like the concept because they didn't like the guy's shoes. And I remember thinking, this is the dumbest approach to understanding what people think about what we're doing. It had absolutely no sort of psychology orientation, no emotion. I didn't know that at the time, of course. I just thought, who cares what his shoes look like in this concept? I want to know what he thinks about the concept, what he thinks about the idea. And so that sort of led me down this path of kind of thinking about market research and thinking about the relationship that businesses have with the organizations or the customers and the clients and the people that they engage with. And I remember then starting at a market research agency, working at a consulting agency, and they were sort of very social science oriented. And I remember in the interview talking about the fact that in my ideal sort of world, right, in my picture perfect sort of kind of portrayal of what a perfect business relationship looks like is that it looks like any other relationship that you have in your life, right? The relationships you have with your best friends, with your partners, with your family, just obviously needing to be at scale in some way, shape, or form. But even though organizations, obviously the kind of the idea is that they're scaling this kind of service or scaling this model, scaling this idea, the individual that is buying or engaging or giving up their time is experiencing it at an individual level, right? They're experiencing the psychology of that relationship, the emotions of that relationship, the dynamics of that relationship. And so I wanted to figure out, how do we, as an organization, create a model that allows us to scale, that allows us to have 1,000 employees that are all delivering this sort of experience to our customers. And yet on the customer end, they experience that in that sort of very personal kind of way in which it's not, which can happen oftentimes even in the best of companies, where it feels like you're just this number in the system versus feeling like they actually care about me and I actually want to care about them as an organization. And so that just kind of kept bugging me in the back of my head throughout my career until eventually my boss said, hey, you should go get a degree in psychology, a PhD in psychology. And that just opened the door to the space of narrative, consumer psychology, the field of identity. And that ultimately is where I kind of landed on figuring out how all of these little pieces are still at play, even though, I mean, we think of them as customers, we think of them as these sort of beings that aren't people, but they're people that have the same psychology they have at home when they're dealing with their family, with their kids, with their friends. And so once I sort of got rid of that film that we put over these people, you could really clearly see the psychology. You could really clearly see the relationship that they have with businesses and the way they interact with those businesses. And that became really powerful for me.
You know what? When you talk about it like that, it just makes sense, doesn't it? When you're like, well,
It
yeah,
does.
of course, it's a relationship to me, and it's like every other relationship. It needs to be watered and nurtured, otherwise it goes cold, and it
Yeah.
takes effort. But where do you think organizations fundamentally get it wrong when they go about communicating in this sort of top-down way? Why have we ended up in this position where so many brands, regardless of the scale, are communicating in that way?
I think the primary driver is distance from the consumer, right? Distance from the person that is purchasing your wares, your services. If we think back to kind of the origins of the economy, when it was very much small businesses in a local community serving that community, right? So the cobbler that lives above the cobbler shop and is, fixing everyone's shoes in the neighborhood, they had personal relationships with everyone. But as we scaled, as we sort of tried to find these efficiencies, we then created distance. The guy that owned the cobbler shop is now in a high rise trying to get all of these other cobblers that he's trained in his approach to do it the way he did. And he or she no longer then is directly interacting with that customer. And it creates that distance in relationship. And in an effort to sort of help manage that, you do create processes, you do create these structures and these systems because you want everyone to sort of be trained in the same model that you have. But in doing so, it strips some of that humanity out of the experience overall. So I think one of the things is just it's part of the nature of scaling, right? And that's not necessarily to say that that's like wrong, that we shouldn't scale businesses. I think it's just about how you then scale has to be really thoughtfully done. And one of the stories we used to tell about an organization that did it right, one of the big organizations that did it right was, the Southwest of the olden days, right? Southwest Airlines here in the US. They would have consistently some of the highest customer satisfaction scores. And when you looked back at it, it wasn't that they flew planes differently. It wasn't that they charged dramatically differently, though of course they had a much more affordable sort of price structure. One of the things that influenced customer satisfaction the most is that they empowered their frontline employees to satisfy the customer in whatever way they felt was appropriate, right?
Right.
And that meant the person who has the relationship isn't constrained by processes from someone 10,000 miles away. They get to focus on the relationship right in front of them. And so they could then build that, and each individual customer would do that. You see Apple sometimes does this a little bit pretty well in regards to the relationship you might have with the Genius Bar. I don't know about it as much anymore, but I remember when the iPhone first came out, after 4 or 5 years, everyone had a story of going to the Apple store because their phone was broken and them just replacing it for you. And that just built up this relationship with what you felt the Apple brand thought about its customers, what you felt about the individuals in that store thought about you. And it created a relationship that, you can't go to another tech store and sort of get that same experience. And so I think there is the ability, and I think the need for many of these organizations to scale, but in creating that distance, they have to make sure they're finding ways to still maintain the closeness of the relationships between their customers and the individuals that are serving those customers.
That Apple example is a brilliant one because you can see that across generations as well. My parents are still talking about how they go to the Apple Genius Bar and just basically bother them quite a lot. But I can see how that works really well. I mean, are there examples? Have you got an example where a brand hasn't done it and they've come unstuck as a result?
Yeah, the one we've talked about for a while now, if anyone remembers Radio Shack, which was, I know, at least a very American brand, and it was, a technology store, and it was for technology geeks like myself who wanted to build their PC from scratch. And you'd go and you'd find the devices, you'd find the elements, you'd find the pieces to sort of put that together. As time has changed and is evolving, their sort of need to sort of serve their customers shifted in a couple of different ways. And they weren't really keeping up, unfortunately, right? They weren't sort of evolving with the way the marketplace was evolving. And they started to sort of develop and figure out ways to sort of change their brand. And they developed this campaign, "You've got questions, we've got answers." Right. And it sounds great, right? Like that tests well, especially in a technology oriented sort of space, especially at that time, when there was still a little bit of sort of tinkering needed in most technology. Nowadays, you don't do anything. You take it back to the store and they fix it for you. But and so the idea, the promise, the story sounded right. But you got there and you very quickly realized that the 16-year-old staffer that was working in Radio Shack there was no way they could answer every question you had about the thousands of products they had in their stores. And so they had this sort of really great idea, but they didn't actually think through what the relationship would be like with the customer and how that customer would experience the store firsthand. So it sounded great, right? If you're back on the 13th floor of a high-rise in downtown Chicago developing this campaign, great campaign, love it. If you can't live that story, the whole thing falls apart. And it becomes where it's not just you failed, right? Like if there wasn't that campaign there and you just went in, it'd be a little bit of a different story. But the fact that you're making that promise, you're creating that narrative. And so you drew them in and then essentially sort of betrayed the narrative once they got there. That's worse than even just doing something different really well.
Yeah. And I think, it's an idea that keeps coming across with all the guests that we have on this podcast, is this idea of intention and living your values and actually following through with what you're saying. And so it's a version of that, really, isn't it? But then can I go back to the idea of this narrative economy?
Yeah.
Because what's actually being exchanged there? Are we looking at is it identity or status? What is it that people are giving up? Or
I think identity is sort of the right direction, although you're not necessarily exchanging identity. I think what you're exchanging are the elements that allow an individual to shape or express or build the identity that they desire, essentially, right? So it's a lot like if you're selling cake mix, you're not selling the cake, you're selling the elements that allow them to make the cake themselves, right? That is sort of how the narrative economy works. And so when you have a product, when you have an idea or a service, when someone engages with that, to some degree, depending on what they're looking for, it allows them to tell a story about themselves. Sometimes they don't tell it to anyone else. They just tell it to themselves of, I'm this kind of person. I do this kind of thing. I support these kinds of organizations, right? So when I go to the local kind of, small business coffee shop in my community here, that lets me tell a story about the way I support my community and the way I believe in small business, the way I believe in individual roasters, right? There's a family I know now in my community that's been roasting their own beans and selling them. I buy their bags because I want to support that sort of individual roaster there. It lets me sort of have that story versus I can't tell that same kind of story when I shop at the big box store. I might be able to tell a different story about savings or about being a savvy shopper, but I can't tell the story about being someone who wants to support a community or support a small business, things like that. So those different organizations help you create that story, and then that story shapes the way I think about myself. So if I think about myself as a generous individual, a creative individual, a community-oriented individual, those stories can help me sort of do that. If I'm just always buying off of the internet, it's hard for me to sort of support that sense of self.
That makes sense, right? I can see that you would want to build your kind of sense of self out like that. But
yeah,
I mean, there are a lot of people out there that buy off Amazon and get it delivered next day,
for
right?
sure.
And so,
for sure, myself included. Admittedly.
Yeah. I mean, it's so damn convenient. But I guess that's falling into that idea of like, I need things quickly because I'm really busy. And then there's also the part with Amazon where, similarly to the Genius Bar with Apple, they're going to fix something very quickly if you have a problem with something, right? How does a brand create this story? Like, because there's an idea that story, and we find this a lot when clients come to us, they're like, right, these are the stories we need to tell. And it feels very downstream from the strategic thinking. But actually, after reading your book, Start with the Story, like the strategy of the story and what you're saying is so powerful. It really needs to be thought about much earlier on.
You're exactly right. And the way I think about it is your storytelling work as an organization needs to begin at the strategy level. It needs to begin before you utter a single word, communicate a single thing to your customers. You need to be thinking about what is the story we're going to sort of be as an organization. And in order to do that right, I think there's a couple of steps that need to happen, a couple of really critical steps. And one is, what is the story your audience is telling, or the audience that you want to engage with are telling, right? What are their aspirations? What are their challenges? What are their barriers? What are their objectives and their goals and their needs? And what are they doing today? And how do they feel about what they're doing today, right? You have to really kind of understand the audience's story first, to then figure out, where could we fit into that story? How might we change that story or impact that story? Because you might be able to sort of completely transform what they're doing, or you might be able to make it better, right? It's not necessarily that it's bad, but you can really sort of enhance or deepen the emotional reward in that story. And so you've got to think about that first. And then once you've sort of identified that, then you can start to figure out, okay, well, what's the kind of narrative that we're going to tell? Right? What's the kind of narrative that defines ourselves? Because I think in doing the study, the work that I was doing in narrative and narrative psychology, one of the sort of key things that I started to realize about storytelling is that it's not necessarily just a communication tool. Stories are relationship maps in many cases, right? Stories are about how one person relates to another and how that impacts things overall. This is what stories ultimately were about in the first place, is right, of capturing relationships between different sort of individuals in power, or the leader and their subjects, and the things that people would do in order to sort of make something else happen, right? How do you build this barn? How do you build this pyramid? How do you do these things? It was all about sort of mapping out these relationships, as well as the behaviors and the instructions and the elements of that relationship. And so one of the things in that, and when you look at it, the sort of best stories that we've consumed as a society are some of the most complex relational stories in the world, right? I mean, Game of Thrones, Downton Abbey, all of these really sort of magnificent stories had some of the most complex relationship maps you could probably imagine, right? But that's what these stories are for. These stories are about and include the sort of map of relationships. So then when you start to think about that in your own organization, you can start to think about, okay, how does our story map into their story? Right? How does what we're doing fit into what they're doing so that we can create a relationship? And what kind of relationship do we want to create when we get there? Are we going to be, the kind of elixir that transforms them into this, sort of different, better, more confident being? Are we the tool that they use that helps them break through problems? Are we the resource that they have that helps them understand something? Or are we just the sidekick that kind of helps navigate this whole scenario with them, right? And there's different roles that you can play depending on your organization, depending on what your consumer is looking for. And so the first critical step is to say, okay, what kind of story are we going to tell? If you start by just figuring out the stories you could tell, you may stumble into the right one that would fit your organization, fit your customer. But if you want to save time and do it even better, you got to start by thinking about the kinds of stories and then which ones fit into that. Which ones can I tell that best express this idea?
Yeah, and this is kind of leads into this idea of story versus narrative, right? So why is there a difference between that? And we've had a couple of our guests have talked about the separation between the two, but why is it really important to not think of them all as one thing? Because I think that's something that's often confused when people think about storytelling.
Yeah, and it's tough because we use them interchangeably for the most part. Even today in this conversation, I probably use them interchangeably. But when I try to sort of analyze it, when we try to plan it and design for it, I think it's important to separate them because, from my perspective, the narrative is the sort of the seed or the big idea embedded inside the story. And the example that I offer in my book, the example I share to when I run seminars and work with clients is, imagine the narrative is sort of like love always wins, right? That's the sort of narrative at the heart of everything. Now, you can tell that story in different ways, right? So that narrative can be expressed in Shrek, in The Notebook, and When Harry Met Sally, right? Three very different stories, but all tied back to a single sort of narrative. And so we think about the narrative as the core idea, as I mentioned in the book, the mannequin that will then be the shape for the dress that goes on top of it. Right. And so the narrative is important to map out because that will then give your story shape. And that's really sort of the important part about planning is sort of mapping that out. That's why you hear, if you've ever heard the process of when, writers write a novel or write a movie script, they typically have like a map on the wall of what the whole plot is meant to kind of feel like before they start writing, right? They've created the narrative structure and then they start putting sort of the decoration on it. They start building the flesh around it. They start building sort of the kind of form to it, if you will, using storytelling techniques.
I think that I can hear sort of like, clients and old brands saying, we've already done this work. We've done our brand positioning. We know who we are. But I think you would argue that some of that work really is too self-centered. It's too kind of like reflecting on themselves. How do you, I guess it's a conversation around ROI. Like, how do you get people to really kind of understand that this is a really vital foundational layer that they can execute?
It sometimes works. Traditional positioning has been around, I think, since like the 60s and 70s, essentially at this point. And it was really oriented around what's our product, what are its benefits, what are the reasons to believe that these benefits are real. And there was like maybe one question that was, who's our audience? And I find that's a very self-centered approach to branding. It was a better approach than we had before, right? Because we really didn't have a structure beforehand. We were just sort of winging it on kind of vibes, is what they would say today. They probably didn't say that then, I imagine. But and so that approach really was, I think, though it was described as sort of a branding exercise, it was really about product positioning. It's how do you sort of place a product in a marketplace? How do you place it in a consumer's life? It wasn't about relationship building or what I think is really branding, right? And so where I think that needs to shift, and what I think is sort of important about an approach that is less self-centered than that, is when you use a narrative approach, you're really trying to understand who else is there, not just yourself, but what is the world you're navigating. And when you're doing that from a consumer's perspective, when you begin with the consumer story, it forces you to not be self-centered. Because if you position your brand as the hero of the story, there's no room for the consumer to see themselves as the hero of the story. And if they don't see themselves as the hero, there's no reason for them to engage with this narrative in the first place. You have to create the space for the audience to be the hero. Whether that's a consumer audience, it's a B2B audience, it's a nonprofit audience. The audience has to see themselves in the story and see themselves in a way that feels like it's their story that they can tell and that they can express. And when you sort of brand in that orientation, you create a stronger relationship. You create a more loyal relationship. You tend to see better kind of purchase intent, but not only purchase intent. You tend to see greater spend with the brand and greater return spending with the brand. Right? They will come back and spend again because they have built their relationship. They have created this story, and they've been able to tell that story because of your brand. And they're going to want to tell that story again, because if they stop engaging with your brand, that story starts to fall apart for them, right? So if I say I'm a creative person and I purchase this specific brand of pens that allows me to draw really well because I think that they're a really sort of a pen that understands the creative process. If that pen stops sort of branding itself as part of the creative process and it starts sort of going into a whole different direction around, note taking in business meetings, right? I can't tell that story about being creative with this pen in my hand because the pen is no longer a creative tool anymore. And so that sort of is the same thing with any of the organizations we work with, is that if you can sort of find that story and you can then orient how you serve the story your customer is trying to tell, they're not going to want to replace you. It's going to be difficult for them to replace you because then they're going to be sacrificing their own identity if they try to.
For years, we've been saying to brands like, please try to stop shoehorning your brand and your messaging into the film as you go through. And it's pushing jelly uphill. Like, it's really difficult to get them to do it. But, we're starting to see that. And I think, when you talk about that example, that's a really good one around creativity and how you associate. And a brand that does that really well that we work with is Adobe, right? Like, they do it's a software company, but it could be positioned in so many different ways, but they really, focus on that creativity and they just present their users using the tools and showing all the creative things. It's inspiration. It's not, here's the software. And so I think that's really important to be able to do that. One question that comes up, I guess, for me is, we know that self-report can be a bit unreliable, and how do you understand this from consumers or organizations? How do you really understand this life they're living, this narrative that they're living, so you can position yourself accordingly?
Yeah, I mean, self-report is notoriously unreliable, but there are ways to create more authentic and more genuine sort of self-report responses in the audiences that you're dealing with. One of the reasons I think self-report is so unreliable is that what we typically do is ask someone to explain why they did something. We ask them to explain the reasons if they would do it again. We ask questions that force the mind essentially into what's the right answer mode. Because the mind isn't designed to know itself, right? That's as much as so many of us are probably going to therapists or should be going to therapists. We need someone else to help us understand ourselves, right? It's not sort of a natural process. The mind doesn't care if you know why you did something. It's just trying to get you through a social situation, through a survival situation, that kind of thing. And when we put people into these sort of research environments, into these interview environments, the same thing is happening. They're in this sort of social environment, and they're thinking, how do I get through this? How do I please the person in front of me, right? How do I make sure I'm giving them the right answer? How do they make them happy with that answer? And so when you ask someone to sort of tell you something, they will essentially sort of filter what they're saying in an effort to sort of provide something that either sounds intelligent, that sounds valid, that sounds rational sometimes, even though we know from the study of behavioral economics, so many of these choices are irrational or emotional or just fast, and we don't really process them. When you ask them to instead tell you about the experience that you're looking to understand, right? To ask you to tell them the story about an experience, it kind of disarms them a little bit, because in the storytelling process, what you're doing is just sort of getting them to reimagine the experience, to relive the memory all over again. And the more you can get them to think about the details of that memory, what the research shows us is the more they kind of relive that memory again. They experience the emotions again for the first time. They kind of walk through that process. So even if the retelling of that experience isn't 100% accurate, right? If it isn't the highest fidelity, if you will, the importance is how have they made sense of that experience and what story do they tell themselves about that experience? And when you ask them to tell you that, when you ask them to walk through that, they aren't looking for right answers and wrong answers. They're just sort of narrating a process that they went through, narrating an experience that they went through. And with proper probing, with proper sort of follow-up techniques, you can unpack the emotions that were there because they're starting to experience them live again. You can start to see the emotion, if you will, express it. And then you can start to understand the relationships as they describe that. If they tell you a story and your brand wasn't the first thing they mentioned or wasn't part of the first telling of that story, your brand isn't a critical element to that story, right? Because the things that they remember first, the things that are sort of most salient, are the things that are easiest to remember. And if you have to probe and probe and probe to the point where you're saying, what do you think about my brand? They probably don't think much. Now they'll tell you, I think your brand is fine, right? Like, I think your brand is great. I think it's affordable. I like the colors. But if you had to dig for that, that's not a very valid sort of response. Now, if you ask them to tell you a story, I remember years ago doing research for a major motorcycle brand and talking to an individual, and he was telling us one of the reasons he loves his motorcycle is that when he starts it up and he revs the engine, it reminds him of the sound of his wife giving birth, right? To their first child. Like, her screams in labor are reminiscent to him of him on the motorcycle. And so every time he rides the motorcycle, he kind of thinks a bit about the birth of his first child. Now, I mean, what's a better story than that, essentially, right? Where your brand can connect someone so deeply to something that is so important to them. And that may not be an intentional design. I can't imagine this brand went out and was like, how do we replicate the sound of birth in their motorcycles? But they have that connection because the sound of the motorcycle was a critical element to the motorcycle as well. And that's what these individuals start to connect to, those sorts of things where they start thinking about independence. They start thinking about freedom because of that brand.
And when you start to talk about it like that, you can see how it's such a powerful strategic shift to move that in that direction.
Yeah. And to your point about the ROI, I think the thing that we'll see oftentimes, and again, a market research setting isn't proof that change will happen. It is proof that we can see a mind state shift potentially. And what I mean by that is when we're, for example, exploring, a relationship to a product or a brand, especially if we're doing something new, like we're testing concepts or we're doing that sort of thing, one of the things that we're looking for when we do is we ask them to tell us just the story of their experience in this category first, before we've shown them anything. So we have sort of a baseline narrative of their experience, and then we expose them to the idea, to the concept, to the creative. And then we ask, how would that story have changed had this been part of that story? Right? So it's not a fully sort of imaginative, projective question of like, if this were 5 years from now and this were available, what would you do? Because human beings are awful at predicting the future. But if I can anchor them in an experience that they've had, and I say, if we just tweaked this one little element, how would this story have changed? We have a better depiction of whether that's going to have an impact. Whether you have someone who says that the whole thing would feel different, right? The whole thing would be transformative. The whole thing, I would have chosen an entirely different path. That's that kind of response. You'll have a clear sense that this is likely to shift the narrative moving forward.
It reminds me of like one of the stories from your book about the printer and how, like, people, they features, functions, Bluetooth, you're able to, scan from someone's phone as they walk past the printer and then print that photo, and
right.
Rarely ever used. But the idea that, your printer ejects your photo onto the floor and sort of ruins your picture as it's printed was never thought about. And so you get these surprising angles where you're all of a sudden like, oh, we should just focus on how the picture is presented at the end of it. That's the most important thing. Now you've got a framework called Story, right? Which is how people can understand this idea of the hero, and what to do. So can you walk us through this mnemonic and how it works?
Yeah, so STORY is an acronym for, and obviously a very on the nose acronym of the struggle that you identify in the narrative, the tool or technology that your organization is planning to use to address that struggle, the objective your organization has by applying that tool or technology to that struggle, and then the reward that your audience can get if this all works successfully, if they engage with the organization, and then what I call the yearning or the glorious future, but GF didn't build a great acronym, is the sort of emotional benefit, the long-term emotional benefit if all of this goes really well. And the reason I structure it that way is it in many ways sort of mirrors the shapes and the elements of standard stories. Right, when you engage in storytelling on the weekends and in movies or with friends, telling jokes, things like that, is every good story has to have some sort of a struggle, some kind of a transformation, and then some sort of resolution at the end, right? If it doesn't have those elements, it's not a good story. You don't necessarily want to engage. The same thing for the stories and the narratives that we create as organizations. We have to have those elements. Otherwise, there's nothing there. I see organizations that come out and they want to talk about themselves. And so they focus on the things that they do, the benefits that they can provide, but they never identify an actual problem that they solve. Right? They don't identify the struggle that the audience faces. Or if they do, the struggle is very much tied to the lack of using them as the organization. As a result, when the audience engages that or hears that communication, they don't see the relevance to their lives. They don't understand what problem in my life this is going to solve. They understand that it solves a problem that this organization would like to be solved, but it's not my problem that I'm not using your product, right? And so it's critical to have each of these different elements. Otherwise, your story is incomplete. And once you have each of those elements, what's powerful is just as a tool, right? It's not necessarily like a messaging development structure. It's just, can you map each of these elements? And when you do, this is the narrative. You're looking at the strategic structure of your organization or of your brand to say, okay, I know I solve these problems. We solve these problems using this approach. We are doing it in this way, right? So this is how we then deliver on these services or deliver these products. And this is what our customers get and how they feel as a result. You map those 5 elements out and you've got a really clear sense of the kind of story your organization can tell and the kind of relationship that you'll have with your customers.
And the B2B, like as well, when you're in B2B and you're more talking about risk and, whereas like this yearning and the idea of the consumer, it's very clear really, like you're talking about a story, what you're trying to solve, but B2B and it feels multifaceted, right? And you've got to convince lots of different people. How do you balance that? Do you have to have lots of different narratives and stories going on for all the different departments? How does it work?
Yeah, it is definitely a more complex story than when you're just dealing with one audience, right? When you're just dealing with the consumer, you're mapping your relationship to that consumer, and that's it, essentially, the kind of end consumer, the commercial consumer. When you're in a B2B setting, you do have layers of relationships that you have to map out. Now, you may not necessarily need a different narrative for each one of those audiences. You could potentially. If you do, you're still going to have what is likely to be an overarching narrative that ties all of them together. But you do need to understand, for example, the end user of your product, right? The end user of your service, the person that's going to download and use that software, has a very different struggle, let's say, from procurement. And procurement struggle is going to be about potentially how do we make sure we are using the right product in the most effective way at the most efficient cost. And in many cases for them, and in a lot of larger organizations, the efficient cost is probably the thing they're measured on most. And so they're trying to solve for that without, it's some, and they don't always succeed, of course, but like, how do we create the most efficient cost, the most efficient use of our funds while still delivering a usable product to our organization? One of my favorite examples of where I think that falls apart is if you've ever used toilet paper in a major building, right? Like it's the worst toilet paper in the world. They haven't thought about the struggle of anyone else because they're focused on their struggle as procurement. Now, if you're in a B2B setting, of course, you're really trying to figure out, especially if you're in a service setting versus a product setting, you're trying to figure out, how do I address the struggle of this end user, address the struggle of their boss, right, who's trying to kind of effectively accomplish an objective that they have as a department, and also address the struggle of procurement that's going to be comparing me against two other vendors who are competing on different attributes on different prices. If you can clearly map that out, you can very distinctly and effectively build a relationship with each of them while still all being tied together under a single narrative. And that's I think in a lot of cases we kind of give B2B short shrift by saying it's too complicated. It's just about the numbers. There isn't any emotion involved, those sorts of things. And I would dare anyone who has been in their career for a decade or more, or who has had to make decisions about their business that involve investment and budget and choice, to tell me that was just an easy, emotionless decision, right? Like it's impossible. I mean, I have a small business, and the amount of time I have obsessed over whether I have the right email platform, the right AI tool, I mean, it's ridiculous. But I'm trying to figure out, how do I manage, again, that's sort of all within me. How do I manage the budget while also managing the objectives of our organization, while also making it easier for me and my team to do their work? And trying to sort of navigate those three things. As someone in a B2B setting, you have the ability to represent the organization that can help solve all of those problems, right? IBM was classic back in the day, right? No one was ever fired for choosing IBM. That's an emotional story right there, right? Like, you don't have to worry about making the wrong choice at any level of the organization because it's IBM. You can trust us.
And that I'm going back to Will Leach's work there, like cautious regulatory fit, right? Like that's people being kind of like, okay, my job is to make sure this is right, and so like understanding those mind states can be really important as well. I think what we live in a world at the moment where trust is at like all-time low. There's a lot of anxiety around. We need to sort of replace the language and change things internally, I think, or externally as well, and how we think about brand reputation. And what's a new way that we could use to think about this, and how might that start to build trust? And then my follow-up question for that is, when trust is broken, how do we then start to kind of communicate? If you're already fighting against the tide like that, what's the first step?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the very beginning of our conversation, where you have to look at it at the way the individual processes trust, right? Because when you start to think about trust at scale, it will fall apart to some degree. I always hesitate when organizations start talking about, we need to manage our reputation. It's like, the reputation is the outcome. If you focus on trying to manage the reputation, you don't focus on the elements that actually drive reputation, you're in the wrong space. You're sort of focusing on the wrong end of the stick. At the end of the day, there are a number of different frameworks for understanding trust. They all come down to relationships, and the kind of relationship that you're building with the individual. The framework that I've most commonly used is about the capability of an organization to do a thing that it's promised, the length or time of having done that, right? So the proof of that experience, so that the individual who is going to engage with you believes you can do that. So they see you have the resources to do it. They need to then believe you have the credibility to do it, essentially. And then basically the actual act, the behavior of, if when this happens, do I see it? Do I see the proof of that overall? And so when those three elements come together, and they come together repeatedly, you'll start to build trust, because also trust is a time kind of based framework. You don't build trust on the first day, you build trust on the 100th day, because you've consistently done the thing that you said you were going to do for 100 days. When we're sort of doing that, the thing is, again, as I mentioned, it's all about sort of that relationship, and trust is kind of very slowly built over time. You can borrow trust certainly from others when you do reviews or you do testimonials and that sort of thing. But trust is a very sort of personal, direct experience by the individual on the trusting end, right? On, do I trust this organization to do what I'm asking them to do? If you focus on sort of fulfilling that promise. That is it. You don't need to really do much more than that. And if you do that repeatedly, then they will begin to build trust that you can do that. Now, I do think the thing that we need to push beyond is just trust and then move to loyalty, because trust and loyalty are also two very different things, right? Trust is, I believe that you can do this. Loyalty is, I will sacrifice resources when push comes to shove to maintain this relationship with you. That's what I think most organizations actually want. I think trust is on the way, but what we really want is loyalty. You want someone who is going to see a competitive offer and stay with you anyway. And one leads to the other. If you've built trust, you will get to loyalty. And what's important about when you get to that point, when you get to that space is, if something goes wrong, they are more likely to forgive you. They're going to give you more grace in that situation. If you respond as you should in a trusted relationship to sort of make up for that, not only do you apologize, do you sort of make it right, it actually builds trust even more strongly than having done everything right the whole time.
Yeah, so you can make a mistake. You can get things. We all get things wrong. Humans who are behind brands always get things wrong, and so that's okay.
Not only will you make a mistake and can you make a mistake, trust is built because mistakes are made, right? The idea of trust at a psychological level is that it allows us to sort of account for the noise in any transactional relationship. If you had relationships that had no trust in it, it would be very transactional. You do this, I'll do that. The next day, as long as you do that, I will do this. If you don't do that, I'm not doing this, right? And that's it. But most of our day-to-day relationships aren't like that, right? We have misunderstandings and miscommunications and failures in the relationship. And if we cut off my grandmother the first time she didn't make my grilled cheese properly, right? Society would collapse. Instead, trust allows us to sort of cushion around those things, to account for noise in the relationship. So it's not a tit-for-tat model, which is what that previous model is typically called in the social sciences. It's a generous tit-for-tat model. It's one that allows that if you haven't fulfilled your end of the relationship, I will be forgiving, because the resources that I would have to spend to find someone that could do what you do, that understands me the way that you understand me, that slots right in, are so great. I would rather give up a day of poor service than to do that. Now, if you are consistent about those failings, or if you don't respond well, that trust will fall apart. Or if you have built trust on a platform and then you've completely betrayed that platform, the individual will experience what is known as betrayal, which is actually a much stronger emotion than distrust, right? Like the opposite of trust. The worst consequence isn't distrust. The worst consequence is betrayal, because they will essentially sort of be disgusted by you, which is a very sort of bad emotional sort of valence, if you can imagine. And to some degree, that's what happened with Volkswagen, if we remember, during Dieselgate, right? At least here in the US, right? There was this sort of push for their diesel engine vehicles, and consumers were purchasing them because they believed they were more environmentally friendly, they were more fuel efficient. And so you can imagine all these individuals in the suburbs of these cities purchasing these diesel vehicles, really proud that I'm the environmentally conscious one in my neighborhood, right? And probably telling everyone that's why they purchased it. And then all of a sudden the news drops. And the story they told about it being environmentally friendly now gets turned into, look at this idiot that believed these cars were environmentally friendly. That's betrayal, right? And it takes a lot for Volkswagen to sort of recover from that. If you saw the comments after that came out. Now, they've been working to make that up, and they've tried to sort of recover from that, and they're doing that well. But you still see people who are kind of experiencing the betrayal of that. That was maybe more than a decade ago at this point.
Immediately makes me think of Elon Musk and Tesla and the damage that he's done to his brand. You sort of...
When you see people driving vehicles with a sticker on the back that says, I purchased this vehicle before I realized Elon was an idiot, right? Like, I loved Teslas. I thought they were great cars. I thought they had cool technology. I wanted one. And now I don't, because it's not going to tell the story that I want it to tell. I don't trust it to do that in an effective way.
And another example from your book as well that I think really speaks to that betrayal is it's Kendall Jenner and Pepsi, where
yes,
that protest and taking the like a Pepsi is going to solve all these issues. It was so blind.
It's not even betrayal. It's just they're telling stories that they shouldn't be telling, right? That's not their story to tell. They were assuming a role in the story that wasn't theirs. And so absolutely the betrayal was, what about the people who were doing the work, right? Who were actually there at the protests, leading the communities, gathering the communities, inspiring the communities, and then to come out and say, but Pepsi, right? Like, just not a great look, because it says Pepsi's the hero of the story, and they're not.
On LinkedIn the other day, and just a creative director was still referencing it as like a really pain point, really, for the brand. And in fact, in that video, he was talking about something very interesting, which was really about, like, as a brand, you're either depositing or you're withdrawing. And so, by kind of coming up with these campaigns that are focused on creative and surprising and delighting people and building that trust, that's what you need to do, rather than this kind of moment where you do something wrong and you withdraw. So it's constantly like pushing and pulling, and you need to kind of invest in the idea, really, rather than the kind of pushing the messaging the entire time.
I completely agree. I mean, my definition of a brand is that it is a relationship between the consumer and the organization, right? The brand exists between. Again, I think when we talked about nomenclature of things and that we need to rename things, I think branding needs a new nomenclature as well, because you have a brand manager, which doesn't make a ton of sense because they're not necessarily managing the brand. The brand is sort of the result of the marketing experience that they're managing. So they might attempt to say they're the relationship manager in that scenario, but the brand is defined just as much by the consumer as it is by the organization, as it is by society around that organization. And I think that deposit and withdrawal idea is a really great one, because it kind of goes back to that tit for tat model, right? Like, in the relationship, you are either giving or you're taking, or you're doing so in hopeful equilibrium, right? Like, it's no relationship does well if you're the only one giving and they're the only one taking. It tends to fall apart. At least someone eventually decides, hopefully after a while, this isn't for me.
Yeah. So I want to kind of think about AI, obviously, always creeps into every single show we do, but
Sure.
It's really how this can be used in a world of AI where, there's so much content out there, from our perspective, so much video flooding everywhere. And, and it's this, if brands focus on the narrative psychology element, if they focus on the story that their consumers or their teams are living, is that going to cut through, do you think, from the sort of work that's out there? Because it feels like there's all these surface stories that are being spat out at the moment, and some brands are really doubling down on it, and they're going for it. So is there an opportunity here then to kind of use more of this to connect on a deeper level? And how do you think AI would filter into that as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question right now. My sense is, and again, I am observing this live just as anyone else is right now. And so anyone that claims to be an AI expert is just someone who's added expert at the end of their name. I think I have a couple of layers of thoughts onto this. One is, organizations thrive in relationships with their audiences when those organizations maintain and even encourage elements of humanity within the organization, right? During the pandemic, when everything was shut down and it was just it was an unknown. No one knew what and how to navigate moving forward, businesses as well as people. And I was in a webinar, and one of the things that I suggested to organizations that were trying to navigate this time was, whatever you do, default to being human, right? If you need to be more transparent about something, if you need to explain something, why something's not happening or working, do so, right? Don't try to cover this whole thing up and make it seem like you're just this perfectly run organization. Recognize there are human beings within your organization who are affected by this. Your customers are human. They're affected by this. If you need to, change your refund policy or your whatever it might be, do so. Lean into the humanity of the moment. Those are the brands that will survive the pandemic. And I think those largely were the brands that survived the pandemic. This is why I loved, like, when you saw some of my favorite stories during the pandemic, like IKEA published their meatball recipe, right? You had people doing things like this that you, in any other world, you would have never had them do that. But they recognized the sort of humanity of the moment and leaned into it. And now there's still IKEAs around, right? And they do really well. So I think the reason I bring that up is I think AI pulls away from that humanity, depending on how an organization leverages it. I think Duolingo recently, right? They kind of got into a bit of flack, and I'm not sure, I haven't checked yet to see how it's going, where they basically sort of leaned in and said, our organization is becoming an AI-driven organization. And just that statement, even though there's probably more nuance and more detail behind it, the consumers responded and said, well, I guess I need to get off of Duolingo if you're no longer going to have a human being developing the learning curriculum, developing the language sort of process, developing and understanding the different languages to learn. If it's just AI driven, who am I relating to at that point, right? Why should I care? So I think the organizations that sort of shift and make everything AI are sort of doing so to their detriment. And what we're seeing from the social science perspective when it comes to AI is, to your point, I mean, these AI tools are very effective. They're not perfect by any means, right? But what we see as far as the way people are building relationships with kind of AI platforms and just AI in general is very much kind of akin to that metaphor I had earlier about how do you build a product versus you build a brand. People are willing to sort of engage, be satisfied and content with an AI product in a moment, but not long term. The sort of engagement with it tends to drop off over the long term, whereas engagement with the sort of human-driven sort of products and brands tends to increase over the long term. And so I think it's a very much a unfortunately, probably sort of very kind of capitalistic driven. I need to make as much money right now this quarter, and probably is effective in doing so. But it is not going to be great for, I think, the long-term health until we find the right balance between AI and human within these organizations. And that's where I think the power is going to be. I don't think AI is inherently a bad tool. Other consequences aside that we can debate on a different show in regards to environmental impact, water use, electricity use, that sort of thing. I think the idea of AI is actually a really wonderful tool for us to use as a support to humanity, essentially, right? As a support to creating potentially more creative kind of objects, more creative deliverables, more creative videos and products and outputs, not necessarily as the replacement to the creative process overall, because human beings inherently engage and recognize the humanity in others. They also naturally recognize the inhumanity in things that are inhuman, right? And so if you've ever been on, this is, I guess, back in the day now, when you used to ever be on the, like talking to someone on the phone, and you could tell they weren't paying attention because you could maybe hear the subtle clack of keys or that slight delay. You just knew something was off. The mind has a very sort of great and effective way of identifying whether someone is actually engaged in the relationship. We read relationships really well. And AI is essentially, I have a friend of mine who teaches around the subject of AI in organizations at Northwestern University. And he said, AI is the definition of a sociopath, right? It can mimic empathy. It does not experience empathy, right? And what does it mean for us as a society if we start placing our relationships and our emotions into a thing that doesn't actually care, but makes us think we care? I think the curtain will be pulled back at some point, psychologically speaking. We'll say, well, that's not right. And we'll want to move on to a different kind of relationship with AI and AI products and a specific relationship with sort of human-driven products. I do think it will eventually drive the value of slow, a deliberate, intentional, thoughtful, imperfect things. I think we will be thirsting for those kinds of experiences and those kinds of products. I mean, to see the kid, I have teenagers now, to see them tell me I need to get off my phone and touch grass, right? Like, they recognize the power of having human social experiences that are slow and imperfect and awful, even as much as we say they have no attention span, right? But they're driving it perhaps more so than we are.
Yeah. But I think you've articulated that brilliantly, and I think it's what a lot of people are feeling at the moment is like, this feels novel, it feels exciting, but
And it is.
It is, yeah. But is it going to last? And I think there's a time coming where it is going to be reassessed. And we often talk about like, why did we not, exactly as you say, why did we not chase AI and become the experts in AI? Is because you can't be that. And actually, maybe AI, from our perspective, might be the best thing that ever happened to casual, because all of a sudden it's flooded with rubbish and stuff that isn't human and considered, and all of a sudden the work that is has a higher value. So, it might be great.
And that's why, I mean, I say in the research industry, because there's a lot of obviously use of AI in the research industry, even to the point of replacing consumer research with AI imitation audiences that are built off of old data. But are kind of built into the kind of large language models so that you can query this AI bot to say, hey, what do you think about this? And my kind of inherent attitude is, if you are planning for the future of your business to be supported by AI, right? Like if AI is going to be purchasing your product, go ahead, interview AI all you want. If you still expect people with cash to give your business money, you need to continue to interview them. You need to continue to understand them, because AI is always lagging behind the human experience, no matter what.
I want to also like just have a real deep dive really into applying this into transformations, internal comms, like how leadership, a lot of our listeners are in that position where they're directors or leading,
Sure.
internal teams. How can this be applied internally? What's the first step that people can take to start to think about how their employees' stories are what they should be addressing when they're trying to change something?
So one, I think you have to understand the employee narrative. You have to understand why they've come to your business, what reward they get from the business. Now, a lot of folks will look at it and say like they needed a job. And yeah, a lot of people do. They need to pay for their mortgage. They need to pay for their kids' tuitions. They need to buy clothes and food and all that sort of things. That's certainly it. The question I always push on that is, well, why yours to do that versus any other organization to do that? Right? What does your organization do differently or uniquely that has drawn them to it? Now, if all you do is you hire a lot and you offer no other benefit, no other relationship to the organization, you probably don't need to be worrying about internal communication, because they're not going to last very long in the first place. If you are an organization that is worried about how you're communicating with your organization, the stories that you're telling with the organization, you're probably trying to do more than just be a paycheck, right? You're probably trying to create a meaningful benefit to them, engagement. You're trying to develop them. You're trying to obviously do more than the bottom line would depict. You're trying to develop contributing members of society. You're trying to develop professionals. You're trying to create perhaps a legacy for your organization. So it's important to understand what drove them to your organization. That's going to essentially sort of tell you what is the internal story that's being told now. You then need to figure out, as an executive team in some cases, or as a leadership team, how do you fit into that narrative, right? How do you stay connected to that? Because as I mentioned, while we create distance between ourselves and the consumers as we scale, organizations create distance between their leadership and their employees as they scale as well. And so you have to kind of keep working to shorten that distance, and stories are the best way to do it. Stories communicate and telegraph and deliver so much in such a little package that you can obviously sort of communicate your ideas to them. And the really sort of important part of it is, and this is critical to most organizations when I do this kind of consulting or workshopping with different clients, is if you are just delivering basically either through video, through PowerPoint, or through speech, just a litany of bullets, right? They won't remember any of it. And bullets is such a really sort of wonderful metaphor for this kind of thing, because the fastest way to kill a story is by having bullet points, essentially, right? Now, if you strip the bullets away and you just create a narrative, right? And you go through that same process. What's the big idea I'm trying to tell? How do I tell that? What kind of stories am I telling? Audience is going to be absolutely critical to this, because you're going to tell the story to one audience differently than you will to another. Once you sort of map that, not only do you communicate the same information that was in those bullets, You give the audience a way to understand that data. That's what narrative does at its core. It helps us make meaning of complexity. And so when you've created narrative as an organization, when you tell those stories and you're using that to communicate to the organization, you're not only telling them, hey, this is the direction we're going as an organization. This is the challenges we're facing right now, right? If you're trying to sort of help calm fears about, the shifting sands of society right now and economies and things like that. If you're trying to explain to them, just the way we're growing or how we're merging or that we're acquiring another organization, when you deliver them in that story, you communicate that information. But then because you've created a narrative and because the mind is inherently a narrative-driven machine, you have already translated it into the way that they can understand. So then they will simply tell that story again, right? They won't make up a new version based on data because you didn't give them a story to begin with. If you don't give them the story, they will create one. If you want to get ahead of that, if you want to help shape that narrative, you have to sort of provide that for them. That's why it's so critical. I think it was Nora Ephron who wrote When Harry Met Sally and those kinds of movies, and she said, if you don't control your own story, someone else will do it for you. If you don't tell your own story, someone else will do it for you. So you have to have those stories in place in order to shape then the stories that your organization is telling. And if you don't, I've seen it. It's like chaos in a narrative sense, where everyone has pulled something different out of this session, and none of it was what you had hoped they had taken away.
That in turn then creates this sense of distrust in the leadership. Everyone's got
Absolutely.
conflicting stories, and then there's that
distrust, incompetence, right? I mean, what if your story isn't clear, they just don't get it. They just don't understand what you are ultimately asking them to do.
It's Walter Fisher, isn't it, that talks about us being homo narrans, like the way we understand. He's a professor in the 80s, I think, that talks about communication, and he says, like, we understand things through stories. That's how we process information. And yet, even now, like how far on we are now, like you still just see everything listed out, and it's this very left brain way of working, right?
Yeah, and I think it is a structure that was created essentially by organization because they believed scaling required simplifying, right? In order to understand a thing, you had to break it out of, what it was sort of the poetic or the narrative form into the sort of taxonomized structure, if you will. And so we believe that's how you communicate information, where even though, right, the greatest educators and philosophers of our time were inherently storytellers, right? And so sometimes it's like it's an unwiring of the mind to get us to go back to organizations and become storytellers rather than bullet point presenters.
Well, look, thank you very much for coming on. I've got one more question that I want to ask you before we wrap up. And it's a question we ask all of our guests at the end, and it's our audience of one question. So when you're writing your book or when you're communicating or the idea, there's this idea that you should have one person in your mind, when you're creating. Who is that person for you, and how does that change your work?
Who is that person for me? The first person that came to mind is this wonderful client that I've had, and I'll just name her first name. Her name is Rebecca, and she is such sort of a wonderful individual in the sense of she is open to new ideas. She's open to having her ideas challenged. She's open to the concept of the social sciences and the psychology of everything. She's open to learning from others. And she's also just so wonderful about then acknowledging the effort that others have put in. And so I'm always thinking now, because I met her after I wrote my book, but now as I write and I'm writing a blog post or writing a thing or preparing something, I'm thinking like, what would Rebecca think about this? How would she respond to this overall? So I think about her specifically oftentimes when I'm writing of, would she engage with this? Would she understand this? Is this clear enough for her? Can she use this in her organization? And would she share this among her team? And that's kind of how I write for that. That is one level. The other level is my mother. And I write my mother, who is, 50 years in the school system. She runs a private Catholic school in South Florida. She's the principal of that. She is not in my world, but she reads almost all of my content. She proofread my book. She's proofread my dissertation. She's done all of that. And I think, can I write this clearly enough, and that she who is an extremely bright woman but is not in this space understands it, and can begin to sort of see how it's relevant even to her own space. I write for her as well.
Yeah, I think they're both great choices. I mean, the idea of that client who gets it or leans the open. I think it's the openness is the key thing, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
the move we've moved towards this behavior sciences and the social sciences in video production. There are certain clients that are leaning into it and going, "Oh no, this makes sense," and there's others where it's very much a closed door immediately when you talk to them. So, I can see the value in that type of client. Firstly,
And my idea is, if I write for her, maybe I'll get more of her in the future, right? Because that's the client I want more of.
and I was raised by teachers as well, so I know the importance of that. Like constantly being corrected with what I'm doing, and it's incredibly
Indeed, yeah.
valuable.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much for coming on. Obviously, we
Thank you
want
for
to
having me.
thread some of this into our own work as well, and we hope to kind of get you on the show again and talk about that once we've done a bit more, a bit further down the road.
I would be happy to. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the wonderful conversation.
If this episode sparked something, curiosity, a new way of thinking, or something you're going to take back to the team, we'd love to hear about it.
Absolutely. Make sure you're subscribed, leave us a rating, and drop us a comment. Tell us what stuck and what you want us to explore next. We want to know.
This is The Audience Connection, sponsored by Casual, the video partner for global brands trying to build trust with their audiences. We'll see you next time.